I wish Mike would have tried a little harder to scare me off. Well, thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here. Always great to be in a room full of like-minded folks. And thank you for getting out early and coming to be a part of the event. I'll try to be fairly brief. I assume there may be a few questions we want to talk about and let you guys kind of drive the conversation a little bit. So this is my second year in the Senate, beginning my second year in the Senate, and it's been, first of all, it is really an honor and really a humbling thing to be able to serve in this capacity. You know, as Mike alluded to, I was a musician for a good chunk of the beginning of my adult life, and never really expected to be in this position, and it's one of those things that you kind of feel like you're living on borrowed time to begin with, because I never thought I'd be here, and so it kind of gives you the license and the ability to just do what you think's right without thinking a whole lot about political expedience and some of those things that we can get caught up in at times. But it's been great. My first 4 years in the House, obviously, were the last 4 years of the Nixon administration, and then now my first couple of years in the Senate, it's the beginning of the Governor Greitens administration, and so that's been the biggest change between kind of then and now, as far as how we do what we do and some of the things that we've been able to accomplish. Last year, I sponsored a couple of pieces of tort reform that the former Governor Nixon would have certainly vetoed. Those got signed into law as well as some other things. And so that's been a change in variables that I think has been welcomed. It obviously provides a different set of challenges as far as kind of jockeying for who has the power amongst Republicans in Jefferson City. And so that's something that we saw a little bit last year, but something that, for the most part, I think we're going to continue to govern, and we assume that Governor Greitens is going to sign most of the stuff that we send to him, which I think is probably A1 on our priority list. So I'll talk a little bit about a couple big issues, and then we'll talk about the budget a little bit about higher ed, and then leave some time for questions. So, one of my frustrations over the course of my time in the House and now in the Senate has been, and you could attribute this maybe to term limits or maybe just a kind of change in the political realities, is it's really difficult, and there is no incentive for us to think long term. So the reality of being in the House, you run every 2 years. I mean, literally, you never stop running when you're in the House, and you can only be there for 8 years. And so the idea that you would try to, and that you would think about, and you would advocate for policies that probably won't show any sort of value or any sort of significant value until after you're out of office, would say, well, maybe we just won't focus on those policies. We'll focus on things that are a little more short-term, things that we can put on our next push piece when we're running for re-election. And so, the byproduct of that is a couple of things. One, it's the position that we find ourselves in as it relates to transportation infrastructure, which is an issue that I think everybody in this room is keenly aware of, as you all live somewhere close to I-70. And it's an issue. I mean, I kind of frame it in these general terms, which makes the issue a little bit tougher. But we have a couple of things, both of which I think are good things. We have a balanced budget amendment, and we have the Hancock Amendment, both of which basically put the legislature in the place that we can't fix the problem. We don't have the ability, short of some 2-cent gas tax increases year over year, which I don't even think is actually the long-term solution to the problem anyway. That's what we have the ability to do. But anything beyond that is something that has to go to a vote of the people. And so obviously there's two ways it can go to a vote. We can put it there, or a ballot initiative process can put it there. We put the sales tax ballot initiative on the ballot in 2014, which obviously failed overwhelmingly. I don't think the support was there, but then Governor Nixon also kind of sabotaged it a little bit by putting it on the August ballot. But so that's a problem that we continue to wrestle with, and it really is kind of an interesting dynamic because we don't. We talk about it, I was at a dinner last night with a number of my colleagues, and we talked about it for probably a half hour. And it's something that we talk about a lot behind the scenes, but you don't see a lot of movement, as far as significant proposals moving forward to actually do something to address the problem. And so we had a long, prolonged debate last week on utility grid modernization and utility grid infrastructure improvements. We got that bill out of the Senate for the first time in eight or 9 years. But it also brought up a conversation that is as equally or probably more important, and that is the transportation conversation. And so I think that's something that anybody in this room that probably has maybe a bit of a conservative bend, I would say, it's not a conservative value to just kind of procrastinate and to kick the can down the road, because when we do that, maybe in this particular case, it involves the government spending more money. I would always caution folks and encourage folks that I think the conservative view of budgeting and of investing dollars is to say budgets are about priorities, and there's no question that road and bridge infrastructure is a significant and should be a significant priority. There's not anybody on either side of the political spectrum that says that funding our critical transportation infrastructure isn't a function of government. And so I think that's one thing that I'm trying to start in the absence of anyone else really trying to do it, kind of trying to start a dialogue about, okay, what do we do next? And I don't know exactly what that is. I was on the transportation task force that met a number of times over the summer. They recommended, I believe, among some other structural things, a 10-cent gas tax, 10-cent diesel tax increase that would go to a vote of the people. And so we'll see what happens there. There's another proposal that's kind of floating out there that I've heard maybe could get on the ballot that would say right now Highway Patrol gets about $300-ish million of the gas tax every year, and so you could basically reroute those dollars back into back toward roads and bridges, and then a tax that you would put on the ballot would be a public safety tax as opposed to a transportation tax, and so that would be 3/8 of a cent or so that would basically be a dedicated stream of resources to Highway Patrol. So I would assume that one of those two things that I just mentioned will be the next thing that you see on the ballot. I don't know when that will be, and I don't know how it will get there, if it will be legislative driven or if it will be something that the people of Missouri put on the ballot. But so that's one thing that's sitting out there. A couple things we've done really, really well in our first couple years: tort reform and labor reform both. With the existence of a new governor and a new administration, we've been able to pass a number of those provisions. We're continuing to do that. And those are the things that why I say this, they may not be the sexiest ways to grow an economy or get some stimulation in the economy. They're really, really important. And it's no secret probably to any of us that St. Louis was named the #1 judicial hellhole in the country last year. We've moved back to #3. So I say this by hellhole status, we're doing better, which is a good thing. But we still got some work to do there. And I've carried a number of these tort reform bills. It's not about swinging the pendulum too far one way or the other, but I would contend, as would anybody, I think, other than a plaintiff's attorney, that the pendulum has swung too far the other way. And so let's bring it back to the middle. Let's make sure that defendants and businesses have the ability to defend themselves. And in cases where they're doing things wrong, they should be punished. But in cases where a plaintiff's attorney can sue someone for millions of dollars because there are not enough Reese's Pieces in their container, I think that's a problem. And so those are the types of problems and the types of egregious lawsuits that we're working to fix. Talk a little bit about the budget. It's good, not great, or maybe that may be a little bit optimistic, but we're in a pretty good spot. I think we've got, obviously it's no secret that the governor proposed pretty significant decreases to higher education, something that I came out pretty adamantly against. And the reason for that, it's certainly not anything personal toward the governor. I thought his budget was just frankly a bit lazy, and I've said that, and I've told his folks that. Not because I don't think maybe he has the right motives, but because you can do budgeting one of two ways. You can really dig in and find the areas where spending can be cut, and then allow those things, functional things, to move over and invest in things that really matter, as opposed to kind of taking the shortcut, which in our budget is to either take money from higher education or to take money from K through 12 education and then throw it toward a bunch of new shiny programs. So the reality is most of the new shiny programs that he put forward are probably DOA, and we're going to take that money and we're going to invest in higher education. And there's a reason why we do that, because number one, I don't think that investing in higher education, regardless of, and we all have our issues with the way that higher education operates in today's world, but here's the reality of the situation as we sit here in Missouri. We bid for and didn't get in the top 20 of the Amazon HQ2 headquarter that was being proposed, and I think there's any number of reasons why that could have been, but the big reason that rises to the top for me is the fact that we physically and literally do not have the capacity to fill a project like that. We do not have the number of people ready to enter the workforce to facilitate a project like that. Not even close. I mean, they were talking 20,000 jobs. We'd be hard pressed to see a 5,000 job project come into one geographical area, St. Louis or Kansas City or Columbia, and be able to fill that. And so, with that being the case, you ask the question, well, how do you fix that problem? How do you close the gap between the workforce needs and getting to the place where they can be brought into a job environment? And higher education is the answer to the question. And whether it's a 2-year or 4-year, I think the 2-year degree and the stigma that used to be involved with the 2-year degree that isn't really involved with it anymore, I think is a fantastic thing for the growth of the economy and for closing that gap. But we've got to figure out a way to close that gap, because until we do, we will have a ceiling that is lower than it should be. Because we have some really good strengths. Our geography, puts us in a really prime position to attract a lot of folks, which is a good thing. And there's some other things, relatively low tax state and some other benefits. But when these entities say, well, I'd like to move to Missouri, but I've got to figure out a way to hire, 200 engineers or whatever, chances are we're not going to be able to rise to the task. And so that is our A1 first in line problem that I think the reason why we invest in higher education is important. And that is not to say that we write them a blank check. Dr. Choi from the University of Missouri, which if you haven't had the chance to meet him or listen to him talk about what they're doing, you need to do that, because the guy is a dynamo, and he is as passionate as anyone I've ever seen, not just about the university, but about higher education and what it means for the future. He was in the Capitol yesterday, and he talked to probably a group of, I bet you there were 40 reps and senators, and we talked about the review commission that we had established a couple of years ago. They did their job. Jeannie Sinkfield, Renee Holsoff, I think Dave Spence was on that, a few other folks, and basically they said, we're going to go through with a fine-tooth comb what's going on at the University of Missouri, things that we need to fix, things that we can improve structurally, etc. And they recommended a laundry list of things. And so the talk yesterday was to say, here's what was proposed, here's what we're doing, here's what we're continuing to do. And I tell you what, it was really, really well received. And anybody who thinks that that it's business as usual at the University of Missouri, I think would be pleasantly surprised when they talk to Dr. Choi and talk about maybe programs that are being cut because they're not providing value in the long term to the University of Missouri, which those are tough decisions, but they're making them, and I think it's an important thing for us to realize. So, so the budget's going to be. I'm optimistic that the economy will grow faster than we are projecting that it will, and so if we do that, hopefully we'll have some money to spend. But I think probably lastly, and then we can open it up for questions. The one thing I would say, obviously we're in kind of it's just a different political environment these days, and you can attribute that to anything you want, and you'd probably be right, frankly. But I think what really has become more relevant to me as someone who's been a Republican all my life and someone who's always believed that limited government was better than otherwise, is the idea that we can't fight these battles on the backs of personalities. We can't fight these battles based on one individual or a group of individuals kind of leading the charge. This is a battle of ideas, and I tend to believe that we have better ideas. That the idea that limited government and less government intrusion, as far as taxes go, as far as the regulatory environment goes, all of that lends itself to a better and freer and more prosperous society. But you can't, we can't just do it by saying, well, the other guy is bad or the other idea is bad. We have to be willing to, and we have to be able to say why our idea is better. And I think what I'm kind of sensing as I talk to folks, and Columbia is a really good, I think my district is a really good kind of scale to measure where this thing is going, because I represent everything from downtown Columbia to Otterville, Missouri. And those are the farthest things apart from each other that you could ever imagine. I remember in the fall of long before Donald Trump ever gained any traction and anybody thought he had a chance, right when I announced that I was running for the Senate, it would have been the fall of 2015, I went to Otterville. We went on a Cooper County tour, went to Otterville, went to the co-op there, 10 or 12 just good old boys sitting around in a circle, and we were talking about Lord knows what, lots of interesting topics in that group. But the thing that really surprised me as I left was, I said, well, what do you guys think of the presidential race? And at that point, I don't know, it was probably Jeb Bush and Rubio and Cruz were kind of at the top. And every single guy in the room said, we're voting for Donald Trump. And I left and I had my political guy with me, and I said, if the New York billionaire has figured out a way to get these 12, for lack of a better term, rednecks in Otterville to vote for him right out of the chute, there's probably something to this. And so as we've talked about this, and as I've gone through and watched, obviously I ran my Senate election as President Trump was running, you get the sense that people are just they're just ready for people who are honest with them, right? And whether or not you can say anything you want about the president, but the guy says what he thinks. And I think I have learned that there's tremendous value in that. And even to take it a step further to say, I'll say what I think, even if I know that what I'm getting ready to say is going to be in direct contradiction to the person that I'm talking to. Because the reality is, the only way to the extent that we think that the political system currently is a little bit flawed, the only way that you fix that is to interact. The only way that you fix that is to have conversations. And so, I want to foster that in Jefferson City. I think it's important to have those conversations in Jefferson City and to say, as often as possible, let's find a way to move forward constructively and with civility. And I think that helps kind of guide a conversation that's better. So I'm optimistic. I think a lot of folks are just kind of put off maybe by everything that's going on one or both sides of the political aisle. But I'm optimistic because I do think that what an environment like this will do will say, people will generally come back and say, okay, I may not like what this person says, or I may not like this person's kind of MO, but so I want to go back to talking about ideas. And so what I think is really important about the Show Me Institute specifically, and they didn't tell me to plug them, but what I think is important about this organization and organizations like this is that they put a lot of thought and they put a lot of effort and emphasis on the why behind the what. And I think if as a conservative, if I can be better at communicating the why behind the what, then I think there's tremendous value in that. And I think you get a whole plethora of folks that are probably my age or younger that really don't know where they are politically. I mean, I think you could probably make a general push that they are somewhat socially liberal and somewhat fiscally conservative. I think that's kind of how some of this stuff is broken out as I've talked to folks younger than me. But they're kind of free agents. You know, I think that's really what I've noticed is that folks that are my age and younger, I'm 35, they just want somebody who's going to sell them on a good idea and and an idea that's going to make their lives better. And so if we can make our discussion about that, I think we win. And it's not necessarily about winning, but in winning, we get to push forward a set of policies that we think can have a long-term, substantive impact, not only on our state, but on our country. And so I think that is what I want to continue to do in Jefferson City. I've tried to do that as much as possible. I'm not a bomb thrower. I don't say a lot of, crazy rhetorical things about other folks. Not that there's anything wrong with that when it needs to happen, but that's just not. I think there's different ways to do this job, and that's not the path that I've taken. But I'm optimistic. The Senate is functioning pretty well right now, and that's a good thing. So we'll continue to push forward. So I can talk some more, but I'd love to answer some questions in the meantime.
Not ask him to plug us, but we're not going to stop. By the way, I just wanted to mention that we did reach out to some people, some representatives of the other party to offer them a chance to update us as well. They just simply chose not to come. Once again, what Show Me Is wants me to remind everybody, we deal with the policy and the ideas that Caleb was just talking about. We don't really get into the politics, so if we'll open up to the questions, I'll step out of the way. You did what politicians normally don't do, which was get to the point and keep it concise. So we have lots of time for questions, but if you could keep them to policy if possible.
Yes, sir. Last week, yeah. Just to give, it's a bill that's been volleyed back and forth for a number of years. And I'll say a couple things. I'm in favor of it. I'm going to vote for it when it comes up for third read, and I can tell you why. This has been an ongoing fight it started as a fight between Ameren and the providers, utility providers, and at that time, a lot of the industrials around the state that was led by Noranda Aluminum down in southeast Missouri. Noranda closed its doors a few years ago, I guess, and so there's been a continuing, somewhat of a lingering fight about the idea of this grid modernization and what that means as far as electric rates. So what the bill does, I will say that this bill, from a supporter's perspective, is by far the most watered down version of the bill that was ever introduced or put into circulation. Among other things, it caps increases. I think Ameren's 2.85% was in the final version. The other providers are at 3%, so that we've been seeing an average of 6% increase year over year for the past 8 years. And so one of the opposition's talking points was that that this is going to raise utility rates. Well, the reality is it's going to raise utility rates statutorily mandated at a much lower, literally at half of the rate that it would have otherwise. And so there were some other things in there that the providers gave up. There were these trackers and some other things that they gave up. And so I believe our utility infrastructure is like our transportation infrastructure, is dated. There are some things that need to be done, investment into the future, specifically in the areas of cybersecurity. We heard a lot of potential, doomsday scenarios as to if the utility grid got hacked into, what does that mean, and kind of those sort of realities. And so my view of it is not a perfect bill, but the assertion that that this is going to have a greater impact on the bottom line of Missourians as far as the electricity rates that they pay is not true. And there's pretty much no way to rebut that other than just kind of rhetoric. So we perfected it last week, which was a 30-hour filibuster. We'll third read it sometime this week. I would assume it will pass. Out of 33 senators that we have, I bet you it gets 28 or 29 votes. It's got pretty broad support in the legislature. Yep. Yeah, yeah. So we actually had heard. I filed a bill the last couple of years in conjunction this year with Senator Bill Eigel from St. Charles that does just that. It talks about the idea that we have in an environment where more and more people, specifically young folks that are coming out of college and in some places not having a place to go, and so their default then is to become an entrepreneur and start their own thing. The government has put up so many barriers to entry in a lot of cases for them. And so, we started to have the conversation to kind of rethink what that would look like. And what's really interesting about this issue, which I love, is that it's being pushed and kind of the undercurrent came from organizations on both sides of the political spectrum. Because you see the tremendous consequence that it has for, I think folks on the left would say, minority businesses or women-driven businesses. That's kind of where the impetus came from on that side. But so we have a bill that would basically, take a look at when a regulation, a new occupational license, whatever is being put into place, that there are more checks. Sometimes at the legislative level that would just make sure that there is an actual need for that to go into place. And so, when you have an environment where, 20 or 30 year bureaucrats, not that there's anything wrong with being a 20 or 30 year bureaucrat, but you see the world, when you're in that world for that long, you just see the world maybe a little bit differently. And so when we leave them to make all of the decisions as it relates to any barriers to entry in the areas of occupational licensing, I think we run a risk of shutting people out, which is exactly what we've done. And so I'm hopeful that we can get that bill out and get it to the floor and get it through the Senate. Again, I think there would be broad support. It's not an issue, frankly, that I've heard a whole lot of opposition to. People have some kind of around the edges issues that we work on as we go. And the other thing I would say, Jen's here, and something that kind of piggybacks into this. Jen Bukowski came to me with an idea this fall that she said, well, right now felons who have done whatever they've done, they've served their time, they get out, they're banned from being able to sell alcohol, banned from being able to sell lottery tickets. And so what that means is folks maybe who are trying to find the first step on an economic rung forward can't go to work at a gas station, can't go to work at some of these entry-level places that get them their first opportunity. And so she did a lot of the work. We filed the bill that I think will be execed out of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate today, hopefully. It was supposed to be last Thursday, but that...
It was yesterday.
Oh, did it happen yesterday? Look at that. Perfect. So we were going to do it Thursday, and then that cranky little filibuster screwed everything up. But so that's headed in a good direction, and I think all those things kind of go hand in hand. And again, what's really interesting and exciting about that issue area is it is 100% bipartisan. I mean, you have a lot of folks all across the rural, urban, Republican, Democrat, split it any way you want, and you get support from both sides on those issues, which I think is phenomenal, and something that I think will have a really substantive impact on our state. Bob. Yeah, so the ESA bill came through and passed out of the committee that I'm the chairman of. That was a couple weeks ago. So that's on the Senate calendar. That got out, I think it got out of the Senate last year, which was a bit of a feat in and of itself, and then the House just didn't have the time to pick it up. So, I think your disappointment is shared by a lot of folks. The reality of that issue is pretty simple. There's a political reality, and I think it's pretty well noted that you've got that is more of a rural urban to some degree issue, in that you got a lot of rural Republicans who would say, and rightfully so in many cases, and I would say the same thing as somebody who represents a number of rural school districts that are performing very, very well. Would say, well, this is fine for St. Louis or Kansas City, but leave us alone in the middle of the state. And so that's kind of been, so their pushback has been that traditionally, and that's where the battle lines are drawn. You know, I'd say a couple things in response to that. I'd say one, the reality of a charter school ever appearing in rural Missouri is it's pretty low chance of that happening. Not impossible, I don't think, but pretty low. The ESA bill that we passed got narrowed down. Initially, it was basically for any student, and then we narrowed it down to kids with disabilities and, you know, some of those more vulnerable populations. And so the biggest frustration that I have on that issue, and I get along very well with our school superintendents in my district, and we have a really good ongoing dialogue. But the idea that to be for education reform is to be against public education is the craziest thing I've ever heard in my life. And it is, one, it's completely wrong. I mean, it's absolutely wrong. And I think it calls into question the intelligence of the people who are listening to the dialogue. And so that's the one thing that I've always said to my superintendent friends and folks who have pushed back against some of this stuff is, look, you can be against it for principled reasons. I don't have any problem with that, because I'm for it for principled reasons. But don't give me this, it's either one or the other, because that's not how we see the world in Jefferson City, and it shouldn't be how they see the world either, I don't think. And so, you know, hopefully, all that to say that I think as the narrative begins to change, you've seen more support, I think, as new classes of Republicans have come in. I think the support has kind of increased over time, but that's a slow process. You know, I hope we get something done, it's always been my push that, and I've had good conversations with Dr. Stiepelman here in Columbia and others. You got to come to the table. I mean, I think at some point this stuff's going to happen. Obviously, I think they had Governor Nixon as a backstop for a long time now. Governor Greitens, who's pretty supportive of this stuff. I've told him, you know, your two scenarios are. You come to the table and you come be a part of an educational dialogue, because that's a good thing for you to be a part of, or we pass something that you've had no input on and we just kind of move forward, you know. So I think that the dialogue's changing a little bit, but we still got a lot of work to do on that front. There's no question about it. Yep. Well, we have the ability now to override line item vetoes, which is something I think that when that happened, 14 maybe.
But not with withholding.
Yeah, not withholdings. Yeah, so we can. You know, I'd say a couple of things. One, as long as the money's there, if we put together a fiscally responsible budget and the money's there to spend, he can't withhold. He's not going to withhold, right? And so that puts the pressure on us to make sure that, you know, that we're spending money that we have. And again, it's a much tougher thing for us. I mean, we do have the advantage to some degree of being a little bit later on in the process, and so we see, you know, I get year-over-year budget numbers every morning, and so we have a little bit more context than he and his team had when they were writing the budget initially. But you know, I think like I said, if we spend money and we spend it on things of importance and value to the people of Missouri, and the money is there, then I think we have pretty much full control over it. And so, you know, obviously in a world where he line item vetoes something, if we've got 2/3 of support, then we can override that. If the money's there, he's not going to withhold, and if it's not there, then he will, and that's a reality that we've seen for any number of years.
As a follow-up, what's your basis for optimism about the economy? Why do you think it will perform better than projected?
So we set the two things. One, we set the CRE, the consensus revenue estimate. We set it pretty low. Senator Richard in the Senate wanted to set it at 0 because we've always kind of overshot it, and then gotten into the place that you're talking about, that we give the governor, you know, real significant power over the budget. So we set it pretty low. It's 2% for the remainder of FY18, 2.5 for FY19, I believe, and you know, there's reason to believe, based on these year-over-year numbers, or year-to-date numbers that we're getting, we're in a pretty good spot now. You know, you're going to see some of that go down with tax refunds going out and some of those things. But so you know, I think it's probably based on, I'm a glass half full guy for one thing, but I think everything that we've seen so far, and probably some of the stimulation that we've seen from the tax reform at the federal level, I think a combination of those things, if we can, there are a few unknown variables that we aren't fully aware of, and those are the things that could probably throw us into a bit of a issue. But otherwise, the things that we know presently today gives us some reason for optimism.
All right, so we're here representing Mizzou's undergraduate student government.
Yeah.
We appreciate what you said today and have historically said since your election about higher ed. My question is more about, it has seemed that regardless of whether it was Nixon or Governor Greitens, that every year there's a battle about higher education funding. So that makes it difficult for any organization to plan long-term financing or long-term planning. So my question is, what do you suggest as a more long-term solution to higher ed funding so you don't have these yearly uncertainty and this yearly battle?
Well, you know, one part of it is it's always going to be a battle. That's my answer that you don't want to hear. But the way that our state budget is set up, and you know, this has been covered ad nauseum in media and whatever else. You know, you've got 3 or 4 big pots of money, and that's where all in a year where there's issues, that's where everything comes from. So it's either higher ed, it's K through 12. It used to be corrections. Corrections kind of got dinged for the most part. And then, you know, any sort of Medicaid, you know, social service spending, the reality of that is that it's much, much harder to get at that money because a lot of that money is so tied up with strings from the federal government that even if we would want to do something with it, sometimes you have to have a waiver or whatever else. So it comes down to, in many instances, a fight between K through 12 and higher education. And so, I mean, taking money from big kids is easier than taking money from young kids. I mean, that's the political reality that you deal with, okay? So that's the kind of the surface level one. I would also say this. If we can continue to do the things that we're doing at the university, new leadership, Dr. Choi, Dr. Cartwright, the new curators who I think are having a great impact, very engaged and having a great impact in Jefferson City. If the narrative year over year continues to improve, every year that it improves, it becomes much, much harder for us as politicians to say, well, this is the easy place to take money from, and so we're going to do it, because it's the path of least resistance, right? And so I think there is no. I always said in a lot of the media things that I did after the events in 2015, there's no shortcut out of that. That was we were called on the carpet in grand fashion. All of the things that happened on our campus, all of that stuff happens at every other campus around the country. It just became public in a very, you know, national and international way for us. And there's no easy way out of that. And so it was an intentional decision for us to say, okay, new leadership, you know, a new outlook, some of the things that we've become comfortable with, we can't be comfortable with any longer. And so all of those things are happening. And so I would say this year, I would be surprised, and it's my goal, that I think we can get all of those cuts restored that the governor has proposed, get it back at least to flat funding, which I think the higher education folks would, you know, stand up and cheer about at this point. And then every year after that, you have a conversation about why is this valuable? Why is it valuable to invest in higher education? You know, not just from a should we give them more money or not, but like the nuts and bolts of the importance, you know, for the economy, for the workforce, all of these other things, for the research capacity at our institution. I think as that narrative gets better and better, then it becomes harder. A lot of my colleagues is to say, yeah, there are issues, you're frustrated about things that you've heard or seen or whatever else, but let me tell you about some of the good things. And let me tell you about, here's how we collectively can help change a narrative for the better for the University of Missouri and for any other 4- or 2-year institution. And so that's a lot of long, dedicated, hard work, and there really isn't any shortcut out of it, but it's getting better. Every year that passes that new leadership, you know, does new things, and frankly, we stay out of the news for things that you know we don't really want to be in the news for. All that stuff makes it easier for us to move forward. So it's ongoing. I mean, it'll be a yearly fight, but I think we're in a better position now to take the fight on. Yep.
What's your opinion of Eric Greitens?
Is Rudy still here? Oh, okay.
It's not a direct, it's not a direct policy question,
Yeah.
but it has to do with policy.
Yeah, okay, so, I would say a couple of things. One, like I said earlier, he's signed 95% of the things we've sent him. So in that respect, he shares a lot of our values as far as, litigation reform and labor reform and education reform, some of these things. So all that's good. I have been very vocal with, not only, I don't just do it in public, I do it with him and his team, that I've really been disappointed in how they've handled, their interactions with the legislature. It's not that, I'm not one of these guys that thinks that I'm really, really important because I'm a senator, right? That's not who I am. And he can call me a corrupt career politician all day long. It doesn't bother me in the least. It does bother some of my colleagues, but it doesn't bother me. The reality of the situation that he was put in was that, we had so many things that had kind of been backed up. Good, from our perspective, really good policy initiatives that were just, the governor had vetoed or we never got the votes for, or whatever else. We were going to give him, a really, really good resume for whatever he wanted to do going forward. And I didn't care that he had ambition. That was not something that bothered me. But that was all really kind of put on a foundation of you need to have good relationships. And so the one thing that I would say that they've done incredibly poorly is to reach out to the people who actually passed the laws and to say, here's how we can work together. I would say part of the reason why education reform struggles is because he doesn't have good relationships with folks on the Republican side of the aisle who traditionally cling to kind of a traditional, non-establishment view of education. And so I think there's probably a scenario where if those relationships were there, they could have gone to maybe Senator Gary Romine or Doug Leibler, some of those guys from rural Missouri who've kind of fought that fight, and he could have used some of that relational capital, maybe to move something forward. And so I think they got a lot of work to do. I don't really know. I don't have any ill will against him as an individual, but I just think they've made a lot of missteps. And he can continue to wave the outsider flag, and I'm okay with that. It obviously in today's political environment works really, really well. But at some point you have to govern. And I think that's the one thing that they haven't as a team haven't quite figured out how to do just yet. And I think a little bit of humility and a little bit of willingness to say, okay, the past is the past, and now we're going to move forward, because I tell everybody, this is a generational opportunity that we have right now with Republican majorities and a Republican governor. It may not happen again for a while. And so if we squander that because we would care more about protecting a brand or about our egos than actually doing those things, then shame on us, and we deserve whatever we get.
Quick follow-up. In light of some maybe recent humbling experiences, do you see a little bit of that happening? And do you think do you kind of share the view? And I know you can't speak for the whole caucus.
Sure.
Do you kind of share the view of the caucus, or?
Yes. I mean, I would think, he doesn't have many allies in the Missouri Senate right now. And I think that's something that he is going to have to work in a very intentional way to fix. And I've always been one who's tried to have and has reached out and have had plenty of, policy meetings in his office and, had good interactions. Yeah, I think there's a chance that probably recent events would cause them to change their view of things. But I think we'll see. I mean, we haven't really seen it yet, but obviously this is still really fresh, and we'll see what happens. But again, I just always go back to, we can't miss this opportunity, because this is, the reason why I got into doing this is because of having I have a 5-year-old, and just being concerned about what the future of my state and my community looked like for him. And so to miss a chance to change the world for the positive for him because we got so caught up in our egos is ridiculous. And so we've got to figure out a way to fix that. And I think everybody's on the hook for that. There are plenty of senators who think more of themselves than they should. And I think the governor can probably take a lesson there too.
Senator, thank you so much. I don't know how much time you got us.
Yeah, I can stay afterwards too.
But yeah, well, I want to be respectful of everybody's time, so if you want to visit with the senator, just grab him afterwards. Also, we do have our 2018 blueprint. We've got a few of those left over there. I don't think we have enough for everybody. But if you're really interested to see what we are proposing as far as good policy for the state, it's here, and our most recent newsletter is here, and of course, follow us on social media and all that kind of stuff. So, Senator, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For the time.